time before the first shift began, and the sun had not yet managed to pierce through the gray clouds. The old garage stood silent, its faded signage barely visible hanging crookedly above the entrance, as if resigned to its own forgotten place in the world. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and metal, the kind of pungent aroma that told you this place had seen years of hard work, sweat, and wear. The garage, once a symbol of pride and craftsmanship, had fallen into disrepair, just like the tools scattered across the floor. Broken wrenches, cracked hydraulic jacks, and makeshift repairs were all part of the grim reality that greeted anyone who dared to step inside. But this morning, something was different. Unbeknownst to the employees, a new face had joined them, though not in the usual way. It wasn't a new assistant or a fresh employee from the local temp agency. It was Damian Owens, the CEO of the company, dressed in a worn-out baseball cap and a stained t-shirt, disguised as just another worker. Damian had inherited his father's small chain of garages 5 years ago. When his father, Charles Owens, passed away, he left behind not just a thriving business, but a legacy built on integrity, quality, and respect for the workers. However, in recent years, the garage chain had lost its way. Profits had become the driving force, pushing safety and employee welfare to the back burner. As the company grew, so did the distance between the management and the people who made the business run. Damien, now in his late 30s, had always been distant from the operations of the garages. After inheriting the business, he focused on expanding, increasing profits, and climbing higher in the corporate world. The garage workers, many of whom had been with the company for decades, became faceless cogs in his rapidly growing machine. But today, Damien decided it was time to confront the reality he had been avoiding. He wanted to see what had become of his father's once proud company, to understand how far it had fallen, and more importantly, to understand the workers who were the lifeblood of his business. So disguised as an assistant, Damien slipped into one of the garages where the daily hustle had already begun. The sounds of tools clanging against metal and the hum of machines filled the space. But it was the sight of a woman working tirelessly in the corner that caught his eye. Her name was Emily Harris, and she was a mechanic, one of the few women working in the predominantly male-dominated garage. She moved swiftly, her hands steady as she tightened bolts and adjusted engines, but there was something off about the way she was working. The blood-stained cloth wrapped around her wrist caught his attention before anything else. He watched his stomach tightening as Emily carefully set down her wrench, her face strained in pain. The blood from a deep cut on her hand was dripping onto the floor, mingling with the oil and grease. Despite the injury, she didn't stop. Instead, she glanced up as if bracing herself for another order, her face a mask of quiet endurance. A moment later, a man's voice interrupted her concentration. "Everything okay in there, Emily?" The voice belonged to Tom, the new assistant who had started just that morning. He was still getting accustomed to the garage's chaotic rhythm. "I'm fine," Emily replied, her voice tight but composed. She quickly wrapped a rag around her hand as if the pain was something she had long learned to ignore. "It's just a scratch. It's not like anyone here cares enough to give me a first aid kit." Damien's eyes narrowed as he watched her. Emily was clearly used to this kind of treatment, but the deeper question lingered in his mind. Why was she still here? Why hadn't she left for a better job where the conditions weren't so dangerous and demeaning? As he continued to observe, Damien noticed the poor state of the garage's equipment tools held together with duct tape, oil leaks everywhere, and safety gear that looked more like a distant memory than a necessity. Emily didn't have the luxury of walking away, not with the bills she had to pay, not with the two young children at home who depended on her. She didn't have the choice to leave, and the reality of the situation settled in Damien's gut like a weight. As he silently observed, a sinking feeling took hold of him. This wasn't just about broken tools and poor equipment. It was about the workers who had been sacrificed for the sake of profits. It was about a company that had lost sight of its roots, a company that had once been built on integrity and respect. And as he stood there in the shadows, Damien realized that he was no longer just an observer. He was part of the problem, but he wasn't going to stay silent about it any longer. In the coming days, everything would change. But for now, he remained hidden in plain sight. Just another worker in a company that had long since lost its way, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth and perhaps to right the wrongs that had been done. The garage was bustling as usual with the screeching sound of wrenches turning and the rhythmic hum of engines coming to life. The day began like any other, but for Damien Owens, it was anything but ordinary. Dressed in a faded cap and a simple work shirt, he blended in with the rest of the crew unnoticed as he navigated through the workshop. Emily Harris, the mechanic he had observed earlier, was hard at work under the hood of a car, her hands quick and precise. Despite the pain from her cut, Damien couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt as he watched her the rag around her wrist, barely keeping the blood from flowing further. He hadn't known the true state of the garage until now. He hadn't realized just how far things had fallen under his watch. As the hours passed, Damien's attention was drawn to the other workers, who seemed too accustomed to the dangerous conditions to notice the blatant disregard for safety. His gaze lingered on a makeshift tool set in the corner, hydraulic jacks that leaked oil, a torque wrench held together by duct tape, and power drills, left out with no safety guards. This wasn't the high standard of service he remembered from his father's garage. This wasn't the place his father had worked so hard to build. Damien had grown up in a different world. As a child, he had played in the very garage he now owned, watching his father, Charles Owens, toil away on cars with an unwavering commitment to quality and safety. He had learned early on that the key to success wasn't just about profits. It was about treating people with respect and giving them the tools they needed to succeed. But somewhere along the line, that message had been lost. As the afternoon wore on, Damien saw more of the disparity. While Peter Griffin, the regional manager, walked through the workshop with a smug expression, he ignored the workers' struggles. He barked orders at Emily, as though she were the sole reason the team wasn't meeting their deadlines, while he turned a blind eye to the unsafe equipment that was the real cause of the delays. Damien saw how Peter's eyes narrowed every time Emily spoke up about the poor tools. She was simply trying to do her job, but every attempt to ask for new equipment was met with dismissiveness and outright hostility. Damien's gut tightened as he watched the interactions between Peter and the workers. There was no respect, no consideration for the people who kept the garage running. Instead, there was constant pressure, constant belittling. Every mechanic was treated as disposable, a cog in a machine that could easily be replaced. But none of them, especially not Emily, deserved that kind of treatment. It wasn't long before Damien's suspicions were confirmed. While working alongside Emily, he stumbled upon a worn file tucked away in a dimly lit corner of the workshop. The file was filled with accident reports, dozens of them, each one more troubling than the last. Emily's name appeared again and again, with injuries ranging from cuts and bruises to more serious accidents like chemical burns and broken bones. Each report had a similar story: mistakes, neglect, and unsafe conditions. But it wasn't the injuries that made Damien's stomach churn. It was the note at the bottom of one of the reports. Peter Griffin had sent a memo to corporate headquarters explaining how he was saving money by delaying the maintenance and replacement of equipment. The digital signature on the memo was from Damien's own finance department. His own team had approved these cost-saving measures, and now it was clear to him what the real cost had been: the safety and well-being of his employees. Damien's blood ran cold as he read the memo. The very people who worked tirelessly for the company were paying the price for his own negligence, for his own failure to oversee the business. In his quest for growth and profit, he had sacrificed the integrity his father had built the company on. The thought of Emily, of all the workers bleeding for a company that didn't even care enough to provide basic safety, hit him like a punch to the gut. That night, after everyone had left for the day, Damien sat alone in his car parked in the empty lot outside the garage. The silence of the evening only made the weight of his discovery heavier. He stared at the garage in front of him, the place that had once been a symbol of pride, now reduced to a hollow shell of what it had been. This wasn't just about bad management, it was about a systemic failure. A failure that had allowed discrimination, neglect, and unsafe practices to run rampant under his nose. For the first time in years, Damien felt a fire inside him. His father had built this empire with the belief that a business should serve its people, not exploit them. But somewhere along the way, that philosophy had been forgotten. Now it was up to him to fix it. In the days that followed, Damien made a decision. He would no longer hide behind his CEO title. He would confront the truth, expose the corruption, and most importantly, change the culture of the company that had once meant so much to him. It wouldn't be easy, but he couldn't live with himself if he allowed the cycle of negligence and mistreatment to continue. It was time to act, but Damien knew that before he could begin, he had to fully understand the magnitude of the problem. He needed to witness firsthand the struggles his employees faced every day. And so, with a heavy heart and a renewed sense of purpose, he began to plan his next steps. He had to go deeper, see more, and eventually take the necessary steps to bring Blake Tech Automotive back to the principles his father had always stood for. It would be a long road, but Damien was ready. He knew that sometimes you have to get your hands dirty to make things right. And for the first time in a long while, he was prepared to do just that. The following morning, Damien arrived at the garage long before the workers started their day. He still wore his cap, a simple disguise to avoid recognition, but today he wasn't the CEO. He was just another pair of hands in a room full of people who had no idea who he truly was. He had a plan to execute one that would force him to witness the true state of things at Blake Tech Automotive and hopefully open his eyes to the reality his father had never intended for his business. As the sun began to rise, Damien watched the familiar figures of the employees trickle in, each of them carrying their own burdens. He noticed Emily immediately, her hand still wrapped in the same rag she had been using the previous day to stop the bleeding from her wound. The sight of it made his stomach churn again, but he swallowed his anger. He had to keep his cool. The garage was beginning to stir to life as workers went about their duties, sharpening tools, revving engines, and shifting car parts with practiced ease. The room hummed with the buzz of hard work and the stench of grease and oil. But behind this industrious facade, Damien could see something deeper, an undercurrent of frustration, fear, and exhaustion. These were the people who had kept his business alive, and yet it was clear that no one was looking out for them. Damien spent the next several hours working alongside Emily and the other mechanics, doing what he could to blend in. He listened to the conversations around him, grumbles of dissatisfaction over broken equipment, complaints about long hours, and the steady flow of insults from Peter Griffin, the regional manager. Every time Peter passed by, he barked orders at Emily, ignoring the others unless it was to give them brief commands or snide remarks. It was evident Emily was his target, and yet there was something else that troubled Damien, the way Peter treated the other workers. He treated them like they were invisible, as though their pain, their exhaustion, their needs were not worth considering. During a brief lull, Damien pulled Emily aside. She looked at him with caution, suspicion flickering in her eyes. He gave her a reassuring smile. "I saw what happened yesterday," he said quietly. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I have to ask, why do you stay here?" Emily's eyes darkened, and for a brief moment Damien saw the weight she carried. She looked at the ground, unsure of how to answer. Then she lifted her head, her expression hardening. "Where else would I go?" she replied bitterly. "I've got kids to feed, rent to pay. This is the only place that gave me a chance." She paused, looking over at Peter, who was giving orders to another worker. "They say I'm lucky to have a job here." But they don't care if I live or die. They just want the work done. Her words hit Damien like a ton of bricks. She had been given a chance, yes, but at what cost? The sacrifice Emily was making every single day, working with tools that could literally kill her, putting her health and safety at risk, was something that no one in the company seemed to care about. Her life, her body, was being used as a means to an end. And for what? So that people like Peter could look good on paper while treating their employees like disposable tools. Damien felt a surge of guilt and anger. This wasn't just about broken tools or unsafe working conditions. This was about people's lives, people who were being crushed under the weight of a system that prioritized profit over everything else. As the day continued, Damien's resolve grew stronger. He couldn't just sit back and let this happen. He had to make a change not just for Emily, but for every person in this garage who was living under these brutal conditions. He had to bring the company back to what it was meant to be. His father's legacy wasn't about greed or cutting corners. It was about valuing people, about treating them with dignity and respect. And that's what Damien would do. That evening, Damien returned to his car, his heart racing. He knew what he had to do next, but it wouldn't be easy. He needed to dig deeper to gather more evidence to truly understand just how far the corruption ran. He had to expose Peter, but that wasn't enough. He had to get rid of the toxic culture that had taken root in the company, one that had allowed people like Peter to flourish. The next few days were a blur of work and planning. Damien reached out to Vanessa, his trusted legal director, to arrange a meeting. He also brought in Sophia Kaminsky, a forensic auditor known for uncovering fraud in large corporations. They would help him uncover the truth. They would help him gather the evidence he needed to take down Peter and anyone else involved in the corruption. But there was something else on Damien's mind. He had seen firsthand how hard Emily worked, how much she sacrificed just to survive in this environment. She deserved better, and Damien had no intention of allowing her or anyone else to continue working in these unsafe, demeaning conditions. By the time the meeting with Vanessa and Sophia took place, Damien knew he couldn't wait any longer. He had to take action. And it wasn't just about the garage. It was about creating a company that would finally honor the legacy his father had left behind. It was about showing people like Emily that they were worth more than the broken tools they were given. Damien's plan was set in motion. There was no turning back. It was time to make a stand. The next morning, Damien arrived at the garage before dawn, his heart pounding with anticipation. He wasn't the CEO today. He was just another worker in a sea of people who had no idea who he really was. He kept his worn cap pulled low over his face, blending in with the others as best he could. But this time, he wasn't just here to observe. Today the moment of truth would arrive. Today he would finally take the first step toward uncovering the deep rot festering within his family's empire. The air was cold and the garage still lay shrouded in darkness as the first workers trickled in. Damien stood quietly by his car, watching Emily walk toward the entrance, her hand still wrapped in the same dirty rag she'd used the day before to staunch the bleeding from her cut. He clenched his fists in anger, the sight of her making his stomach twist. How had it come to this? How had they allowed her to continue working in these conditions with no regard for her health or safety? As the garage began to fill with the sounds of motors revving, the clanking of tools, and the hum of machinery, Damien felt a deep unease settle in his chest. Every turn of a wrench, every stroke of a screwdriver echoed the neglect his employees had suffered for far too long. It wasn't just the broken tools, the rusted equipment, or the dangerous conditions. It was the culture, one of exploitation, discrimination, and a disregard for human life in favor of profit. Damien had to act. The first piece of his plan had already been set in motion. He had met with Vanessa and Sophia the night before, carefully reviewing the evidence they had gathered. What they had uncovered was worse than Damien could have ever imagined. Peter, the regional manager, had not only been negligent in maintaining equipment, but had also been embezzling money that should have been spent on safety and tools. And worse still, Peter had been manipulating accident reports, downplaying the number of injuries and near-death incidents in the garage. The evidence was damning, but the truth wasn't enough. Damien knew he had to confront Peter, but he also needed to make sure his employees were no longer subjected to this toxic, dangerous environment, and he needed to do it without letting Peter or anyone else know that he was the one who had uncovered the truth. He spent the morning working quietly alongside Emily and the others, getting a first-hand look at the chaos that was unfolding in real time. His hands were raw from handling the same broken equipment Emily had been forced to use, and his heart sank as he witnessed her still working. Despite the pain from her injury, her hands were shaking as she tightened bolts and twisted wrenches. It was a sight he couldn't ignore and a harsh reminder of just how much she and the other workers had sacrificed for a company that didn't even care. Around noon, Peter walked in, his usual smug expression plastered across his face. As always, his eyes immediately fell on Emily, and without hesitation he barked at her. "Aisha, that Civic still isn't done. What are you waiting for?" Peter snapped, his voice dripping with condescension. Emily, despite the obvious pain in her eyes, lifted her head and stood a little straighter. "I'm working on it," she said, her voice steady, though the strain of holding it together was clear. "The tools are just—" "I don't want to hear your excuses," Peter interrupted harshly. "Get it done now. And you rookie," he turned to Damien, "carry those parts to the back. We don't have time for slackers." Damien stayed calm, pushing his frustration down. He could feel the weight of his role, knowing that today was the day everything would change. He worked silently, taking mental notes of everything, every unsafe practice, every careless action Peter made, every insult hurled at Emily and the others. It was all being documented. Today he was playing the part of the invisible assistant, but tomorrow Peter's reign would end. The afternoon dragged on, but as the clock ticked closer to 3 p.m., Damien received a text message from Vanessa. The time had come, the evidence was ready. It was time to confront Peter and expose the corruption he had allowed to fester under his watch. Damien took a deep breath and walked toward the office, his footsteps echoing in the cold, hard space of the garage. He knocked lightly on the door, and without waiting for permission, he opened it. Peter looked up from his desk, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Damien. "Can I help you?" "Rookie," Peter sneered. Damien didn't flinch. "You need to see this," he said, his voice low but steady. He handed Peter a tablet where the recorded footage from Sophia's investigation played. Peter's face turned white as he watched the video, his eyes widening in disbelief as his own voice echoed through the speakers. The recording showed him boasting about using Emily to placate HR, mocking her behind her back, and even suggesting that her safety wasn't a priority. This is some sort of joke," Peter stammered, trying to regain his composure. "It's no joke," Damien said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "The joke is that you thought you could get away with this. The joke is that you thought you could continue putting people's lives at risk for the sake of your bonuses, and your bonuses alone." The room fell silent, the weight of the confrontation settling over them. The sound of the garage had faded into a hushed stillness, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Damien took another step forward. "You're done here, and you're not just fired. We've got everything we need to press charges. Embezzlement, fraud, negligence, and worst of all, the way you've treated your workers." Peter's face flushed with rage. "You can't do this," he shouted. His hands clenched into fists. "I already have," Damien said simply. He turned to the door where Vanessa and Sophia were waiting. "Security's on their way." Peter didn't say anything as he was escorted out of the building. His face twisted in fury. The garage was still the tension palpable in the air. But for Damien, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the changes he had been waiting for. Tomorrow, Blake Tech Automotive would no longer be a place where workers were treated like disposable tools. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. And Emily, she was about to find out that her dedication, her sacrifices, and her incredible skills would finally be recognized. The garage was quieter now, the hum of machinery replaced by the tension that still lingered in the air after Peter's abrupt departure. For a moment, Damien stood there, looking around at the workers, some of them still processing what had just happened. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. He had watched the entire system crumble piece by piece, and now the hard work of rebuilding began. As the minutes passed, the shock of Peter's expulsion slowly gave way to cautious optimism. Emily walked over to Damien, her face still pale, but there was something different in her eyes. Relief, gratitude, hope. "You're really doing this, aren't you?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with disbelief. Damien nodded. "Yes, I am. And you're part of this now. You've been fighting for your safety, for your dignity for far too long. It's time to fix this place. It's time to give people like you the respect you deserve." Emily didn't say anything for a moment, but Damien could see the flicker of emotion behind her guarded expression. She had fought so long for so little, and now she was beginning to see that change wasn't just a distant dream, it was right in front of her. But there was still so much work to do. As the day came to a close, Damien called a meeting with the team, including the few remaining workers who had stayed behind after Peter's departure. His voice was steady, but the sense of urgency in his words was unmistakable. "We're not done yet," he began addressing the group. "I know this has been a long time coming. The conditions here have been dangerous, and we've let things slip for far too long. But that changes today. We're going to fix this place, not just the tools, not just the equipment, but the culture, the way we treat each other, the way we respect one another's lives. That's the most important thing here." Emily was the first to speak. "So what's next?" Damien smiled at her, his eyes full of resolve. "Next, we rebuild. We're going to start with the basics, new equipment, new tools, and a commitment to safety. But it's not just about the tools. It's about trust. It's about making sure everyone here feels like they have a voice. No one is going to be ignored anymore. Not on my watch." The workers nodded, the tension that had hung in the air starting to dissipate, replaced by a shared sense of determination. They were ready for change. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. New equipment arrived along with fresh supplies and tools that were long overdue. The old dangerous machinery was hauled away, replaced by state-of-the-art replacements. But it wasn't just about the physical transformation. It was the cultural shift that Damien was most focused on. He wanted to create a place where respect wasn't just a buzzword, it was the foundation of everything they did. Emily became the face of the transformation. Damien entrusted her with overseeing the implementation of new safety standards and protocols. She became the safety and compliance supervisor. A role she never imagined she'd hold, but one she deserved more than anyone. As the days passed, the garage began to feel different. The atmosphere lightened, the workers more engaged and motivated. They felt valued, respected, not just as employees but as people. The press conference announcing the changes to the public was a moment of triumph. The mayor, who had witnessed the chaos the previous day, stood alongside Damien and Emily as they spoke about the renovation of the garage, the new safety protocols, and the establishment of a new standard for employee care. The press was abuzz with the story of Blake Tech Automotive's dramatic turnaround, and it wasn't long before other businesses took notice. The story of a CEO who had come face to face with the reality of his company's culture and chosen to make it right resonated deeply with people. But it wasn't just about the media coverage. For Damien, the real reward came in the quiet moments, like when he saw Emily walking through the garage, her head held high as the workers greeted her with newfound respect. He knew that this was just the beginning, that the real work of maintaining this change would continue every single day. And when the first round of surprise audits came through, the new safety protocols passed with flying colors. No more negligence, no more cutting corners. The garage had become a model for the entire industry. For the first time in years, Damien felt proud not of his company's profits, but of the people who worked for him. He had restored the integrity that his father had built the company on, and he knew that this time they wouldn't lose it again. And for Emily, the transformation was more personal. She had risen from being an overlooked mechanic to becoming a leader, the one who would ensure that no one else would have to suffer in silence. The job that had once felt like a never-ending battle was now a place where she could thrive, where her skills would be valued, and where her future was no longer defined by her struggle. It wasn't just a new garage, it was a new beginning. And for the first time in a long while, everyone who worked there could see a future where they weren't just surviving, they were thriving. The change at the garage was undeniable. The workers, once quiet and resigned to their fates, were now confident and vocal. Safety protocols were in place. The tools were top-notch, and most importantly, they felt seen. But as the renovations were completed and the atmosphere lightened, Damien knew that the hardest challenge was still ahead. It wasn't just about fixing the garage. It was about protecting this new beginning from the pressures of corporate greed and profit-driven decisions that could easily reverse all their progress. The real test came a few weeks later when Damien was summoned to the boardroom for a meeting with the very executives who had once praised Peter for cutting costs and putting profits first. He knew this was coming, the looming confrontation with the board of directors who saw the changes in the garage as a direct challenge to their bottom line. They were used to making quick decisions for financial gain, and they weren't going to like the costs of the new reforms, no matter how justified they were. As Damien walked into the corporate building, a part of him felt the weight of his father's legacy on his shoulders. His father, the immigrant mechanic who had built Blake Tech Automotive from the ground up, would never have tolerated what had happened under Peter's leadership, but he also knew that he wasn't just fighting for his father's name anymore. He was fighting for people like Emily and the other mechanics who had been silenced for far too long. The conference room was cold, its sterile walls lined with glass, offering a clear view of the city skyline. The board members were seated at the long, polished table, their eyes all fixed on Damien as he entered. They knew what he was about to do, and they were ready to fight back. Mr. Blake Richard Townsend, the vice president, began, his tone condescending. "We've reviewed your proposed changes, and frankly, they're unsustainable. This company was built on profit, and these recent reforms are costing us more than we can afford. We need results, not idealism." Damien stood at the head of the table, his eyes calm but resolute. "I'm not here to play it safe, Richard. I'm here to fix what was broken, not just the tools or the equipment, but the culture of this company. My father built this company with integrity, and I intend to keep it that way." Richard sneered. "Integrity doesn't pay the bills. Marcus, if you can't deliver, the shareholders will force your hand." Damien didn't flinch. "I understand your concerns, but the numbers speak for themselves. Since we implemented the safety changes at the garage, productivity has increased by 28%. Customer complaints are at an all-time low, and most importantly, the workers are happier, safer, and more motivated. The profits will follow." There was a brief silence, and then a sharp voice from the end of the table. "That's all well and good, Marcus, but what about the bottom line?" one of the senior executives asked. "Are you prepared to sacrifice profits for these feel-good initiatives?" Damien's gaze hardened. What good is a company if its workers are broken? If they're risking their lives every day for a paycheck? I inherited this company, but I'm not going to let it become a place where people suffer in silence. I'll fight to make sure they're treated with respect." Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. "You do realize, of course, that you've just jeopardized your position as CEO. We've had complaints about your methods. Too many risks, too many financial uncertainties. The board is considering a vote on your future with the company." Damien took a deep breath, his mind clear. "I've already made my decision. I'm not going anywhere. I'll take full responsibility for the changes. If you want to remove me for doing what's right, then so be it. But I won't apologize for trying to build something that lasts. A company where people matter more than profits." The board members exchanged glances. Their expressions mixed with disbelief and wariness. Damien knew that the battle wasn't over, but he wasn't backing down. His voice grew firmer, more determined. "I've seen the cost of doing nothing. I've seen employees bleed for a company that didn't care. I've seen the disregard for their safety, their lives just to save a few dollars. If you think this is a temporary setback, then you don't understand what we're building here. This is the future. We're not just fixing a garage, we're changing the way business is done." The room was silent as Damien finished speaking, his words hanging in the air. For a long moment no one spoke. Then slowly, Richard stood up. His face was pale and he didn't meet Damien's eyes. "We'll discuss this further," he muttered, his voice tight. "But know this, Marcus, if you're wrong, it will be your downfall." Damien didn't respond, but his mind was already racing. This was only the beginning. The real battle wasn't over yet. But he had done the right thing, and no matter what happened next, he knew he could face it with a clear conscience. As he left the boardroom, he couldn't help but think of Emily, of Aisha, and the other workers whose lives had been transformed. The fight for their safety was far from over, but they were no longer alone. They had a champion now, a CEO who would never forget that the true strength of a company lay in the people who worked for it. The dust had settled, but the journey was far from over. Marcus stood at the edge of the parking lot, the now fully renovated garage gleaming under the soft glow of the evening sun. Around him, employees moved with purpose, no longer burdened by the fear and exhaustion of the past. Aisha, once just another mechanic struggling under the weight of injustice, was now the head of the new safety and compliance department. The company was changing, and so were the people who worked in it. Marcus had made the difficult choice to put the well-being of his employees above profits. It wasn't just about repairing broken tools anymore. It was about mending broken systems. The transformation was visible not just in the equipment, but in the way people spoke, in the way they worked together, in the way they stood taller, more proud, more unified. They were no longer just workers. They were a part of something bigger, a company that respected them, that saw their value beyond their ability to turn a wrench or lift heavy equipment. But the fight wasn't without its challenges. Despite the success of the reforms, Marcus knew that the real test lay ahead. There would always be forces working against the change he'd brought, people who would try to undermine him, who would see his efforts as a threat to the old ways of doing business. The corporate world was unforgiving, and while he had won this battle, the war was far from over. However, for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt hopeful. He had proven that doing the right thing, standing up for his employees, for the people who helped build his father's legacy, was not just possible, it was essential. And while he had faced fierce opposition from the very people who should have supported him, he knew that the values his father had instilled in him would always guide him. As Marcus looked out across the parking lot, he saw the future of Blake Tech Automotive unfolding before him, a future where integrity, respect, and safety were no longer just words on a corporate mission statement, but the very foundation of the company. The mayor, once a distant figure, had even become an ally, promising to ensure that the new standards would be enforced. It was a moment of redemption not only for the company, but for Marcus himself. In the end, it wasn't the size of the profits that mattered, nor the flashy cars or high-end equipment. It was the people, the workers who had stood by him, who had helped him rebuild, who had trusted him when he promised to make things right. It was their dignity, their safety, and their well-being that would define the success of Blake Tech Automotive from now on. And as Marcus walked back into the office ready to face whatever came next, he knew one thing for certain. True success wasn't measured by the numbers on a balance sheet. It was measured by the impact you had on the lives of those around you, the lives you helped to make better. And for Marcus, that was the most important legacy of all.